And with that, I want to introduce Reg Harnish. I believe most of you, if not all of you, have had the pleasure of meeting him. He's our CEO of OrbitalFire, a cybersecurity thought leader, an expert in this field. And Reg, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here today. I'm not sure about expert anymore. I feel like the longer I spend in this industry, the less I feel like I know. But I've been doing it for a while, and certainly I've seen some things that work and don't work. But recently, over the last few years, we've had a few things emerge that have created a little bit of chaos for us in terms of what do we talk about in terms of cybersecurity? Where do we see risks? Obviously, AI is part of that. And I think we have a webinar coming up not too distant future on that as well. But I have to say the remote workforce question and concern has really been front and center for many cybersecurity conversations. And some of it's nonsense, as you have probably heard me say before, but some of it's real. And I think for organizations who are committed to moving to a more virtual, more remote workforce for all of the obvious organizational and financial benefits, there are some things that we should be talking about. And so I want to tease those out today, talk a little bit about some of the things that might be more hysteria than reality, and then give you some practical tips for dealing with this. Obviously, as your partner, there's virtually nothing that we can't help with in these cases, even if it's referring a partner or an expert, a third-party expert that can deal with whether it's technology or insurance or things like that. But there certainly are some questions I think we should all be asking ourselves. But as Dana mentioned, it's here to stay. The reality is almost 60% of all knowledge workers in the United States are now working either partially or completely virtually. I talk to my friends, they're all working for organizations where they almost never go into the office. I talk to small businesses all the time who are saying, listen, it doesn't make sense for us to, require people to go in the office. I think we're still seeing where that's all going to settle in terms of, well, not just security, but also organizationally, functionally, operationally, how does this stuff really work? But for right now, we're seeing massive growth in this space, and we don't expect that to really change anytime soon. Probably a good place to start is defining what we mean by remote, because it may not be everyone's definition. It could certainly be working from home. I think this is probably the most popular alternative work site that small businesses are dealing with today. And again, whether it's operational, functional, logistical, financial benefits, there's plenty of reasons to allow people to work from home. I'll tell you, OrbitalFire, we are a hybrid organization. We're in the process of moving offices, but today we totally enjoy a mixed, sort of mixed workplace, which is sometimes we expect our people are going to work from home, but they can come into the office if they want to. And then other times we expect people to be in the office, but if they really need to work from home, fine, no problem. And I think that flexibility is important. But inventorying those things is going to be important as well. Traveling, which we've been doing for 100 years now, never really considered remote because it was temporary. But today you might be traveling from your home office and then going back to your home office. And so it's the concept is a little bit different offline, right? We see ubiquitous internet access today, pretty readily available, but many people have periods of time, whether they're traveling internationally or they're in an automobile, or it could be anything, or in my case, maybe a motorhome, where you're actually offline. And so that is part of the remote context as well. But for us, really, the umbrella is any alternative work site that isn't under your control. So it's not just necessarily about your physical location, but also logically, how far does your cybersecurity program and those controls, how far do they stretch? You go back maybe not even 10 years ago, and those protections stopped at the office wall or the office door. And things like intrusion and threat detection or monitoring or even patching in some cases, those things just really weren't readily available outside the physical headquarters or office. And so for us, we see this more as a logical boundary, which has expanded. I'll talk about that. but also programmatically, where do our controls extend to? And in those environments, how much control do we have over the risk as well as the remediation of those risks? Right. So today, or not today, 10 years ago, this is what the office looked like, and all your people were sort of all centered. The one of the core benefits there was that we were able to manage, first of all, assess and then manage those risks because we had access to all of the devices, the networks. Really, that logical boundary was almost identical to the physical boundary, where the devices lived, where people worked, where were the network connections. And so there was a one-to-one mapping between assessing and managing risks in the workplace because the logical boundary was constricted. It was really the same as your physical boundary. But today, this is what your network looks like. This is what your program's logical boundary really looks like. And these could be houses or hotels or trains. And it's not just the destination, where your workforce member or user might actually be. It's everything in between, right? So all of these dotted lines, that tends to be the public internet, which we know has only become a less trustworthy place. And so when we think about the office now and the logical boundary, it's every one of these boxes in every one of these networks that connects these boxes. Now, anyone who's a fan of or a historian has studied warfare knows that these supply lines tend to be the weakest point and are frequently targeted. And so no different with cybercrime, these issues and the spreading or the sort of the disparateness of this network becomes a vulnerability in itself. So what are some of the risks that we are most concerned about and really want to talk about? So the first is a reminder that cybersecurity, we don't care about firewalls. We don't care about your storage. We don't care about your Dell laptop. We don't care about iPhones. What we care about is data and the risks to data. Now, sometimes a laptop may be the container that introduces the risks. So of course, there's some inherent concerns and considerations around physical devices, but honestly, those things change even when the data doesn't. So really, we're focused on risks to data. And now data is what I call ambient. It's honestly like the air that we breathe. It's everywhere. And it's not just the exhaust that we create as human beings, whether it's credit card transactions or being caught on a traffic camera. It's when we think about corporate assets, if the container of that data moves to an alternate work site, well, the data moves to the alternate work site as well. And that's really where our concerns are. The data itself traveling in a way that maybe we have less control over or even visibility to. So data entropy or ambience, that's really at the core of this, because all of the risk management we do and all of the controls that we deploy and implement and manage, those are designed to reduce and manage risk to data. I have already alluded to the loss of these, what I'll call network or headquarters controls. Your firewall at the office was probably doing some level of threat detection. If you move outside the office, guess what you lose? All of that threat detection. Now, technology has changed. I'm going to talk through a whole bunch of pretty awesome technologies that are out there that can help us manage this stuff. But once you leave the office physically, you do tend to lose a lot of the standard protections. Public Wi-Fi is, I would argue, in some ways, probably less scary and way more scary than people realize. I think, generally speaking, we've established some standards that most, whether they're a merchant like Starbucks or a hotel, that have established some basic controls. And so they're, for the garden variety risks, we see probably less of that. But also we recognize that as those technologies mature, there's a regular, release of new compromises and intrusions on these things. But the reality is, and probably the biggest concern is, we have no control over public Wi-Fi. So we have to prepare for it. We can't fix the network like we can at headquarters. We can't fix the network, so we have to compensate for it. And obviously compensation is a standard part of risk management, but until we even know what those risks are, there's no way to even compensate for it. And so it's the Wild West. We have to assume it's the Wild West. With devices floating around, whether it's a hotel, an Uber, a Starbucks, they're obviously uh, more susceptible to theft, or something I'm going to talk about here momentarily, eavesdropping. Not just digital eavesdropping, but someone shoulder surfing, or overhearing a conversation. You're on a phone call or you're in a Zoom meeting. People can collect all of that information about your organization. Now, some of you probably say, well, that's probably not a big deal. We don't really deal with anything sensitive. But if you're in healthcare, if you're in manufacturing with intellectual property, if you're in financial services and you're working on accounts and account numbers, all of this stuff is potentially more susceptible. And then, of course, device theft is a concern, especially if we don't have some basic controls on those devices, or even worse, was it a device that was stolen that is a personally owned device, which probably doesn't have many of the controls at all. We have a commingling issue. So people who work at home are more inclined to introduce personal devices into the workplace or this alternate work site. So we have concerns about, what is the hygiene of those devices? How vulnerable are they? Is data moving to a personal device? A lot of questions there. I mentioned eavesdropping. Again, probably a little bit of hype to this, but no doubt it has happened. And whether it's just overhearing a password or something juicy about your strategic plan for next year, these things are all more susceptible in an open environment. Some of you, however, and I would say in particular manufacturing, are targeted in ways that once you move outside of a logical boundary or a known, safe or safer, better word, area, you're a much more likely target of some of these types of more advanced. We don't want to scare anyone. Most of you, the Chinese, the Russians are not after you, of course. But some of our customers really do face these types of risks. And so anytime you get outside of that known, controlled, and managed environment, we're dealing with unknown risks and possibly things that are a little more sophisticated. Now, those are all the obvious things. I want to tease out a couple of things that I think go overlooked, because we've had to make this decision ourselves at OrbitalFire about where do we allow people to work, how, what is our risk tolerance, and how much do we want to enforce on devices? What kind of expenses are we willing to incur to ensure that our data is as secure as we need it to be? But the first one is disengagement. Studies are now popping up everywhere, right? So everyone kind of flocked to remote work because they had to. And so we were all scrambling, and people couldn't print, or they couldn't get a VPN connection back to the office. That was the initial concern, but that we've kind of passed that. And now we're dealing with the psychological, the cognitive, the emotional issues from not connecting physically with your coworkers. So disengagement has become a big issue, and it has trickle-down effects in cybersecurity. The more disengaged an employee is, the less likely they are to comply with policy, the less likely they are to be motivated to take the 2.5 seconds that's required to assess an email for legitimacy, the less motivated they are to be a good team player and be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So disengagement, we have not solved that. As a species, we've been social for 250,000 years as Homo sapiens. And so there is a certain amount of compensation that we need to do organizationally, emotionally, all these other things, which are not part of this webinar. But certainly there are risks due to those things. Another one is distraction, which I think is generally overlooked. Whether someone's running upstairs to do the laundry, or they have a barking dog, or their kid tugging on their arm because they, can't, they don't have the password to the iPad. Anytime an employee is distracted, they are more susceptible to other types of cybersecurity risks, or maybe they're in more of a hurry because they're bouncing back and forth between, making lunch and working. And so that kind of distraction just is a vulnerability in itself. And it also generally leads to more cyber-related errors, whether it's getting locked out of an account because you didn't type your password correctly, or you misplaced data, you put it in the wrong place. Could be a whole bunch of things. And then, of course, I alluded to the use of personal devices and how those have affected remote work and introduced vulnerabilities and risk. But, if your child comes up, sits on your lap, and says, hey, Dad, can I just throw Roblox on the computer just for a few minutes? That's a problem. And if we haven't thought about those risks, introducing, unknown software or unauthorized software or activities, browser, websites, it could be anything. If you're mixing your personal and professional lives on a professional company owned and managed device, obviously we're concerned about the risks of those things, because normally we would not experience that. And I have to say it, even though I think this is probably not a huge issue right now, but it absolutely is happening. You may be interviewing a robot today. You may have hired a robot. A robot may be working for your company today. And so this is Tom Cruise applying for a job at a small healthcare practice. No joke. They did the interview over TikTok, and it was completely done as a joke, but the entire interview process was set up and it was 100% realistic. They literally thought that they were hiring, and I forget the name that they used, but they thought they were interviewing a highly qualified candidate for their clinical practice. And we've seen other horror stories. This is not unheard of. It's not commonplace, and I would argue that it's not all that frequent. But for small businesses where, I think there's a more trusting culture, we kind of know everyone, the fact that you may have never met one of your employees is a risk. And we're shipping laptops out to folks that we've never met or physically verified. We never had to worry about that in the past. And now, just in the last couple of years, we've had to worry about that. And then with the advent of tools and scams that really can create a sense of realism and trust. I mean, the quality of deep fake audio today is unbelievable. Video, I would argue, is got a ways to go, but the audio, it's indistinguishable. And so this is something that's in our future. I would say, don't run back to your office today and, you make sweeping changes to detect AI in your hiring process necessarily. I don't think that's a priority today. But it is something that increasingly we will need to be thinking about, and especially for organizations that are moving to a remote workforce to save money. So they're not going to fly people in for interviews. They may not fly them in for their orientation on first day. And so just keep this in mind, that our risks are changing. We don't necessarily know exactly what they are or what they're going to be. And we're going to continue to track this. Now, as most of you know, I'm optimistic. I think most of this stuff can be satisfied or addressed or compensated for with some basic hard work, commitment to risk and managing risk, and just thinking about how do we reduce or manage this risk to an acceptable level. We're not purists, and there's no hysteria here about any of this. And of course, our process is always that there's three components to addressing cybersecurity. Some of you may have heard me say that every cybersecurity risk comes down to a human being, and that's 100% true. But certainly they can be part of the solution, just like process and technology. I'm going to hit on some ideas in each one of these areas, but keep in mind that this is not a technical issue. This is not just a procedural or process issue, and you're not going to train the problem away. It's really a combination of these things, and that's how we manage risk in pretty much all of these areas. So let's start with people. I mean, this, I think, is really central to your human assets and your workforce, and there's a whole bunch of things that we can do, but no more than really starting to think about the culture that you are promoting and allowing and maybe enforcing at your organization? Are you risk tolerant? Are you risk averse? Do you require the same of your leaders and influencers that you require of, someone who is doing daily work? I mean, when people join your organization, is there a palpable sense of security in what you expect of them and what they should expect to experience there? This culture of security is incredibly important. There's a lot of facets to it. And in our next customer webinar, we're going to really dive deeply into how do we build a culture of security. But you should know that whether you intentionally build one or you don't, you do have a culture. And it may be great and exactly what you're looking for, and it may not be. But it definitely affects people's behaviors. Policy, right? So what are the rules of the road? A cybersecurity policy, a code of conduct or a cybersecurity code of conduct, an acceptable use policy. We've all seen these things, a handbook. You should be communicating to your remote workforce what behaviors do you expect of them and what behaviors are prohibited. It's all part of your culture. The more specific you can get with this, right? So policy level is going to be more general, and we're going to talk, in that policy, we'll talk about some high level concepts, things that are generally prohibited and some basic expectations, but you should be figuring out what are the specific behaviors that are expected from people. Logging off at night, establishing an alternate work site that is, safe from eavesdropping or distractions, things like that. Have you thought about that? Defining those alternate work site requirements is also really important. So should it be on a secured Wi-Fi, or do you disallow Wi-Fi altogether? These are all things that you should be thinking about. The identities, right? We talked a little bit about deepfakes and AI, but you should be strictly enforcing that identification. Now, most of you are thinking, well, we have an I-9 process when we go through that, but if you're doing it remotely, how well are you able to verify that that human being is who they say they are? And even if it's not an AI-generated audio and video feed, Bob Jones might be sitting in for, Dan Smith. Do you know? It's a question, and I don't think we have great solutions for that. Certainly the I-9 is not nearly effective in a remote situation the way it is when you're meeting someone in person. So in addition to that I-9, there could be other requirements for whether it's in the recruiting process or hiring. So how do we, ensure that you have a verification process that includes not just the I-9 and the acceptable documentation, but also physical verification. Maybe they need to come to the office for their last interview, or maybe we do require pictures or other types of verification. All important. Training and testing your workforce. So on these behaviors, on security elements, understanding risks, awareness, capabilities, you should be continuously training your workforce, not just on what's required of handling EPHI, but what's required of you handling EPHI at home or at a Marriott or on a plane. That's different. And so think about and review your training curriculum, because if you're a largely remote workforce or you have sensitive data that's now become ambient, you should be thinking about creating awareness and skills for your workforce around those new concepts. And then you should be testing, right? How do we know that the training is actually working? Well, one, we see the performance and results, but two, we test them on those skills. Or maybe we test them on their awareness by doing social engineering engagements or penetration testing, or most of our customers today are engaging us for phishing testing, which is a very basic test, and it's effective, but it's not everything that you should be considering. Communicating. I think it's really important, especially if you as an organization have agreed that the future looks more remote and more virtual, is communicating to your workforce that there are risks and that you haven't figured them all out. We as an industry haven't figured them all out. And that it's even more important that the cybersecurity programs, the training, the testing, the activities have become even more important. And maybe that's part of that's the balance, which is, yes, of course, we want to provide flexibility to our workforce members wherever we can. We also want to experience these benefits. But the trade-off here is that cybersecurity, if it was in third place before, now it's in second place. You have to be hyper vigilant, because even though we feel like we have managed or we have solutions for some of these known risks, the fact is we really don't understand all risks. And that's sort of the basic reality of this. So communication is critically important. All right, in terms of process, really the first step in any cybersecurity program is know what you have. Really difficult to start to protect things if you don't know what your assets are. So no different than figuring out what doors you should lock in your house, or where you should put the shotgun or the alarms and intrusion detection. You kind of figure out, where do you store your jewelry in your cache? That makes the most sense. So that's step one. You should have an inventory of your assets. From there, identify which assets are sensitive, of course, classified in any way, protected, whatever your classification scheme is. And then a new step: is this asset frequently or continuously remote or outside of our control in some way? Because what we want to do is, of that list, and hopefully it's a short one, that's one of the advantages you have as a small business. You don't have a 3,000 list inventory. We really want to focus our cybersecurity efforts in those areas, or at least as we're doing assessments and thinking about remediation, is let's identify these things that are moving outside of our logical boundary. We need to think about, how do we compensate or address these risks? And the only way to do that is to know what you have. Of course, moves right into a risk assessment. The foundation of your cybersecurity program is risk management. We simply can't do all 1,100 things or 1,100 options in cybersecurity. It's not feasible, especially not feasible for small businesses. So identifying what is the biggest risk and what risk-based remediation should I have on my roadmap? What should I be doing over the next 6 months, the next 12 months? Conducting annual risk assessments is the foundation to your program. If you're not doing that, you're not keeping up with the unknowns. And there's a whole bunch of other problems as well. But as it relates to a remote workforce, we're going to continue to discover new problems and new solutions over the next year. We want to make sure that we're capturing that as part of our assessment as we get into that annual process. These alternate work sites, in addition to defining what's required of alternate work sites, and again, you should have these definitions not just for a home office, but also for working on a plane. Is it allowed, or a hotel, anywhere? Like, you should have these definitions, but we want to audit those on occasion. We have customers, more than one, who actually requires that their 100% remote workforce audit their work site. They're even requiring that employee to send in a picture of their work site, just in terms of, one, okay, you can do a little bit of an audit. It's probably not very effective to do that. But what they're doing by requiring that once a year is they're building that culture, which is, we know that there are risks to you working at home. We want to continue to provide these flexibilities and benefits, but know that we're watching, and it's important to us that cybersecurity be extended to your home office in many ways. So we're going to ask you to send a picture in on an annual basis, something like that. And every company is different, every culture is different. So these are really just ideas for you to consider. Device configurations. So most of you on this webinar are probably dealing with an organization where all of those endpoints, the workstations that your employees are using, are company owned, issued, and managed. This does provide some benefit and some advantage because we can control that endpoint, we have the ability to deploy controls, monitor, we control that environment, and that reduces the risk significantly. One of those is secure configurations. Is there a locking screensaver? Is it encrypted? Is it required to be shut down? Are patches applied automatically? And the list goes on and on. If that's part of our configuration, we want to make sure that we're enforcing that no matter where that device is. Luckily, technically, some of these things, this process of configuration management has become easier over the last few years. Certainly, there are a number of IT products and solutions out there that have made it easy to manage devices that are considered remote or traveling or in an alternate work site. Reporting incidents, again, going back to disengagement and distraction, we need to deal with the human, the psychology of this and the sociology of this, but certainly making it easy for your employees to report incidents is paramount, because they are less likely at home to report an incident or something suspicious. Even if it's on a work laptop, they're less likely to report. So we need to train and test. We need to establish policy, but also here in terms of a process, we want to make sure that we have multiple disparate independent mechanisms for reporting incidents. Maybe your email has a report fish. Maybe you have an email distribution like incident@myorganization.com, or maybe you have a phone extension, 911, or maybe you have it could be a web form on your intranet. There are others. We want to make it really super easy to report incidents or suspicious, whatevers, and then enforce it through policy, monitor it, and then, make it part of the culture. That's, all of this stuff kind of works together. Okay, technical controls exist as well. And while we really consider technology a backstop, my first and favorite cybersecurity mentor, Bruce Schneier, once famously said, if you think technology will solve your cybersecurity problems, then you don't understand the technology and you don't understand the problems. And it's really true. This is not a technical game. But however, we do have technologies out there that can be an amazing backstop or a double check, or can help us do certain things faster. And we want to make sure that we're leveraging all of those. The first would be restricting personal devices. You can do that certainly by, technical controls. So whether you're in 365 or in Google, there are ways to disallow data moving off of your device, let's say onto like portable media, so it could be copied to like a personal drive. There are ways to block access from unknown devices. So if, let's say, an employee switched to a personal device and then tried to, connect to your financial system, QuickBooks, Salesforce.com, Office 365, well, we can disallow that because we know which devices are authorized. We can disallow unauthorized devices. And so, again, going back to your policy and what your position is on this, we do have the ability to technically eliminate the possibility of the use of personal devices. It gets harder if you're allowing personal devices as a culture and as an organization. We'll talk about that. There are also technical ways to enforce that when a laptop or a mobile device is in use, that it's always connected back to the office, meaning it cannot go out, even though it's using and leveraging a local public personal Wi-Fi device or network. We can force it to automatically connect securely or more securely to the office, such that I mentioned earlier that we tend to lose a lot of those office-based or physical, facility-based controls. We can force those communications back through the office or headquarters, even if that headquarters is logical now. So things like, virtual private networks, Citrix, there are lots of other solutions. I'm not promoting either of these, but they do help us force communications and activity back through a known, controlled, and managed environment. We can also monitor and control the internet. So pretty much every job on the planet requires some level of internet usage, research, advertise. I mean, it could be really anything, but we now have the ability to monitor all of that activity. One, because we want to control the content. So if we decide that we don't want people checking personal email from a work device or browsing gambling sites or, clicking on Facebook ads. We can control all of that. That's something that's available to us. We can also monitor that traffic for known bad communications with like blacklisted, domains, websites, IP addresses. And so imagine that, technology fails us, one of your users or employees gets a phishing link, they click on it. Because that's internet traffic, we actually have the ability to monitor, inspect it, decide whether or not it's acceptable or not. And if it's not, we have the ability to block that. So we can stop ransomware issues and lots of other things. Again, none of these things are panaceas, but these technical controls, they do exist. Privacy screens, real simple. If you have people who are working in public areas on a regular basis with sensitive data, headphones, privacy screens start to recreate that privacy. I'm going to go back to privacy because it's not something we typically talk about, but the remote workforce movement has created some pretty important privacy concerns. Monitoring, right? So we now have the ability to, no matter where on the planet a company owned and managed device is, we can monitor it for intrusions or compromise or theft or a whole bunch of other things. So we can reduce the risk of these compromises that might be introduced by the fact that they're working outside of our protected zone, our safe zone. And so there are, again, this is a backstop. This is a detective control, right? So it doesn't prevent the problem from happening, but once it does happen, we detect it and we're able to respond to it programmatically. And then, of course, the cloud addresses a few of these issues. So if you are a 100% remote workforce and you are 100% cloud, well, we've actually reduced some of this risk automatically because of your architecture, because of how the organization works. That said, the cloud is no more or less secure than a server running in your office. What's important is, what are you doing to secure those things? And so that said, the cloud is designed to be accessed from anywhere. So there are a few things that we can basically be guaranteed of. And one would be an encrypted connection between that endpoint and that workforce member and the internet or the applications or the data. It would take me a long time to go through all of the benefits of cloud-based services, but that's something that certainly, if it's part of your infrastructure, is an important aspect. If it's not, then it might be a consideration for you. If there are cloud-based applications or versions of things that you're using on premises, then maybe it's another good reason to switch to cloud-based delivery. Okay, a couple of final thoughts. First of all, we've been really dealing with, cybersecurity has been dealing with remote work for decades, literally. I mean, we've been traveling, working from hotels, Dunkin' Donuts, an airplane for a very, very long time. But now it's reached critical mass. So the major difference here is 10 years ago, you may have had someone on a plane working on a presentation with intellectual property in it. But it was once in a while, it was one person, it was one piece of data. Today, it's 90% of your people, 90% of the time. And so we have not changed the impact, but we have dramatically changed the likelihood. And risk is nothing more than likelihood times impact. Impact is the same. If that information is stolen, compromised, the device is stolen, lost, the impact is exactly the same, but the likelihood is significantly higher than it used to be. So it has completely changed the risk calculation and the risk tolerance. That said, again, we completely understand that this is, at least temporarily, this is where organizations are moving or have already moved. And so we want you to know that our perspective on remote work is that we don't care, because working remotely is no more or no less secure. In fact, there are advantages to working remotely. In fact, one of them is this ambience of data means that all of your jewelry isn't in a single place. It's spread out all over the house. It would be impossible for someone to find all of it. Versus if it was all in one place, you only have one target. You can focus all your energy there. Your data now being ambient and spread out, amongst a massive logical boundary actually prevents in some ways or reduces the likelihood of it all being compromised because you have controls and data everywhere. And so those are the kinds of things that we want to help you take advantage of as part of this. No different than taking advantage of your small size. There are advantages to it. Another, and probably really my last thought here, is that we haven't talked about the privacy or legal concerns about remote work, but you should really be thinking about those. And again, our approach is we really want to be a one-stop shop for cybersecurity for our customers. And so if you've got a legal cybersecurity concern, we want to help you solve that. And one of the things, privacy, a very common example, and we run into this, I would say more than occasionally, is individual has work email on their personal phone. And what control do we have over that? It's a personal device. We technically, through policy, and generally I think most state and federal governments would agree that you own the email and you even own the credentials to that email. But it's not very clear. It's very gray about, do you own the presence or the instantiation of that data on a personal device? And so those privacy issues really need to start thinking through, because there is a commingling of personal and professional, because a human being is now doing professional things in a personal environment. And so really give that some thought, particularly if you have a largely remote workforce, or if, again, going back through that asset inventory, if you've got really sensitive or more particularly regulated data like EPHI or PCI credit card information, you really want to understand and start to think about the guidance that's coming out of those industries around handling a remote workforce if you're a clinical provider or you're a merchant, accepting credit card information transactions. For us, it's identical. Again, coming back to, we have no preference as to whether or not you are 100% virtual or 0% virtual. Our job is to help you figure out what are the risks to your data in your environment and conditions, and then help you build a program that addresses those. If you haven't recently and you're concerned about it, in your next cybersecurity review, let's talk about this with your customer success specialist. They have tons of resources to help you answer these questions and really start to tailor your program, especially if you're an organization. And I know that there are some folks here who are planning on a major shift to remote work. If that's a concern and you feel like you haven't addressed those risks, or it's just an unknown for you, let's talk about it. We want to make sure that you feel like there's some peace of mind and that your program is aligning to those changes strategically. Resources, obviously, support, emergency incident response. This is something that every one of your employees can use. Obviously, coming from a primary contact, someone that we know and have met and have worked with, is preferable in these cases. But this is something that you can be sharing. That's our emergency hotline there. And then, of course, your customer success specialist probably has a lot of these answers for you, and certainly they have access to the answers and other experts that can help you with that. So please leverage us as a resource. If you feel like you have questions or haven't addressed the remote workforce risks in a way that you feel acceptable. That's it for today. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. I know Dana will talk about the recording, which we'll make available as well. And if, we don't want to put anyone on the spot. So if you come up with a question afterwards, please email us, email me. I'm going to share my email here if you don't already have it. And we'd love to talk about this and any other concern you might have.